Greetings, good evening, and welcome everyone to the first event of this year, 2021, in the Study of Central Europe seminar series. My name is Jakub Benes. I'm the convener of the seminar series this academic year. I'm a lecturer in Central European history here at UCL CEIS. And I'm delighted this evening to introduce my colleague, Professor Richard Butterwick Pawlikowski, and his new book, The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Light and Flame. And the dates of that are 1733 to 1795. Richard is going to tell you all about the book shortly. I would just like to say that this book is really exciting. I think it promises a fresh look at this complex, unique, and quite important state, which fell finally at the end of the 18th century. This book seems to be, as far as I can tell, a synthesis and culmination of Richard's decades-long interest in the topic. And I'd just like to mention a couple of his previous monographs. The first one, Poland's Last King and English Culture, presumably about Stanislav Ponyatovsky, about whom we'll probably hear a little bit more in Richard's introduction, and then The Polish Revolution and the Catholic Church, both of those published by Oxford University Press. Richard's new book just came out in November 2020 with Yale University Press, and I'll talk a little bit more after his introduction about how you can get a copy. I think that's it from me. Before I hand things over to Richard, it's great to see so many people here. We have over 40 people and counting. Wonderful to see you all here, and we will have, after Richard's introduction, we'll have some time for question and answer and discussion, which I will moderate, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get to that stage. So, Richard, please, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for this very kind introduction, Jakub, and I'm delighted that you're chairing tonight's conversation. And thank you for organizing this event, Claudia, as well. I'm honored. And thank you to the marvelous team at Yale for believing in this book and producing it so splendidly. Do my duty to the publisher with pleasure, because it is indeed a very attractively produced book, which is beautifully illustrated. Light and Flame is a story with a well-known ending, and it is not a happy ending. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also known simply as Poland to contemporaries, was partitioned. Why? Well, the nobility, the Szlachta, was supposedly oppressive and anarchic. It turned its own liberty into an absurdity. So the Commonwealth's better governed neighbours, Russia, Prussia and Austria, put this failed state out of its misery. And that is the story not only by the regimes which partitioned old Poland, but by many Poles as well. This is what Józef Piłsudski said in 1923. Poles themselves have claimed, subsists by anarchy. Poland means private interest. Poland means ill will. Poland means anarchy. And if after our fall we liked ourselves, we have never respected ourselves. We arouse not trust, but uncertainty. Hence the desire to foist on us curators appointed for a nation of anarchy, powerlessness, license, a nation which was led to its downfall by private interest, which could accept no authority. His greatest political and ideological rival, Roman Dmowski, was of much the same opinion. it was one of the few things they agreed on. It is not surprising that the Commonwealth has long been judged by the fact of its dismemberment. In fact, the historical inquiry into the causes began well before the third partition in 1795. It can't be ignored. But in concentrating on the reasons for the Commonwealth's fall, we risk neglecting its achievements. We risk assuming, like Dmowski, like Pilsudski, that harshly governed centralized states with huge armies are better than decentralized communities of citizens which put freedom first. More recently, there's been a strong reaction to the partition syndrome among historians, but also among those who create Poland's policies of history and memory. Today's trend is to celebrate a diverse Commonwealth of many nations, faiths, and cultures, all bound together by shared civic values as a kind of precursor or example for the European Union. It's a much better past for a part of Europe so often dismissed by Westerners as blighted by murderous nationalism and prejudice, and where ideas of democracy, freedom, tolerance, and the rule of law arrived late and supposedly put down shallow roots. There are two versions of this narrative. One is focused on celebrating diversity, the other on defending the honor of Catholic Poland. Both exaggerate, and neither is very good at explaining what happened to the Commonwealth in its last few decades. Writing Light and Flame, I wanted to see where the Commonwealth was heading before its destruction drastically changed the trajectory of Central and Eastern European history. But I still needed to explain the three partitions. Each of these events, 1772, 1793, and 1795, was the outcome of a cutthroat international system which interacted disastrously with developments within the Commonwealth. But that relationship was far more complex than the due punishment for the sin of anarchy. The backstory, as it were, of the partitions is the Commonwealth's profound crisis. Political, military, fiscal, economic, demographic, and intellectual throughout the second half of the 17th century. That crisis enabled Peter the Great's newly proclaimed Russian Empire to establish an unofficial hegemony in Poland-Lithuania in the early 18th century. From then onwards, re-establishing the Commonwealth as a sovereign and independent power was going to be all but impossible. And that was proved absolutely by the events of 1733, the overthrow of a royal election, with which the real narrative of this book begins. Empress Catherine the Great then tightened the screws from the 1760s onwards, and it was she who took the final decisions for all three partitions in Russian imperial interests. In the end, the Commonwealth was unable to resist the superior force of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and the reasons for that go deep. Among them has to be the Liberal Veto. Yes, there were, and there are, good reasons to thrash out consensus rather than simply vote on divisive questions. But the extreme interpretation of this principle enabled foreign powers to manipulate and paralyze the legislature. Even so, during the 18th century, there were a few times when Russia was preoccupied with the Ottoman Empire, with Sweden, or with Prussia. They gave the Polish-Lithuanian political community fleeting chances to exercise the sovereign powers of decision-making using the means of a confederacy or confederation, which was not subject to the Liberal Veto. That's when we can best judge the Commonwealth's potential. Especially the years 1788 to 1792, the years of the Great Sejm, or as contemporaries put it, the Polish Revolution. Of course, there was too much talk and not enough action. Nevertheless, the tripling of revenue, the quadrupling of the army, far-reaching reforms to local and central government, parliament and the judicial system, all were made possible by a new kind of politics with genuine debate about the public good, which did build up trust. Orderly freedom was a slogan that became reality. That nurtured a fundamental change in the understanding of the nation. The nation expanded from the Schlachter or nobility alone, taking in townspeople, that is, urban citizens. The direction of travel was clear. The Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791 declared that peasants were the most numerous and useful part of the nation. That implied the road to the end of serfdom. The Constitution also promised freedom and protection for people of all faiths, not only those religions which had been tolerated until then. That included 750,000 Jews. Of course, they had already enjoyed de facto religious and de jure religious toleration anyway. What was new is that many of them would henceforth enjoy the old noble privilege of neminem captivabimus nisse jure victum, which meant that they could not be incarcerated without trial. Karl Marx, no less, thought it remarkable and admirable that the privileged Schlachter accepted such changes. No wonder that Prussian, Austrian, and Russian ministers feared the emigration of burghers and peasants to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That is worth dwelling on. Because since the end of the 18th century, Poland has become a country to leave, whether for political or economic reasons. And yet for most of the 18th century, Poland-Lithuania was an attractive destination for economic migrants. They included many Protestant German-speaking artisans, farmers, and traders. Lower taxes, fewer regulations, weaker organs of law and order. It was the riskier choice. There was also plenty of internal migration to the growing cities, especially Warsaw, whose population quadrupled between the mid-1750s and 1792. Some newcomers fell by the wayside as petty criminals, prostitutes, and beggars on the wrong side of the law, but others thrived. Even under the dead hand of the Russian protectorate, this was a dynamically changing society with a fast recovering economy, a small but rapidly professionalizing administration, and a flourishing cultural scene. There was creative tension between native traditions and foreign influences, not just in the world of fashion, but also in the realm of ideas. The seeds of the Enlightenment found rich soil in which to germinate. In some cases, reform was forced on the Commonwealth by external shocks, such as the suppression of the Jesuits by the Pope in 1773. This potential disaster for schooling led to the establishment of the Commission of National Education, which faced, and on the whole met, enormous challenges. But the prime example of the successful fusion between old and new, between homegrown and foreign, was the Constitution of the 3rd of May. The book examines the Constitution from several angles. As a constitution, of course, giving its reputation as the first modern constitution in Europe and the second in the world after the American. And by that, I mean a solemn legal framework, usually, but not always, in the form of a single written document, outlining a country's form of government and the relationship between citizens and government, the whole being derived from the fundamental values shared by the community. There is also attention to the language of the document, which was profoundly didactic. This was in order to persuade the Schlachter of the urgent necessity of the changes it contained. For the Constitution was drafted, acclaimed into law, and implemented in an exceptional context, during an interlude of sovereignty between phases of the Russian protectorate. This time, in 1788 to 92, the Commonwealth's Parliament did seize the opportunity to introduce reform. Before the same ended, in the small hours of the 30th of May 1792, there was just enough time to pass most of the supplementary legislation envisaged by the text of the Constitution, for the reformed executive and judicial institutions to begin their work, and for a new kind of politics to bed down. The values of the expanding political community remained distinctly Republican, but with an appreciation of orderly liberty assured by effective central and local government and courts in cooperation with the Sejm and the Sejmiks. In the later legislation, traditional expressions such as the estates of the Commonwealth, the Polish crown, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania reappeared after yielding to the nation, the fatherland, the country, and Poland in the text of the Constitution of the 3rd of May. The dualist character of the Polish-Lithuanian polity also reasserted itself, and that has been important for joint Polish and Lithuanian celebrations of the Constitution in the 21st century. One of the most important chapters is devoted to the potential of the Commonwealth, revealed by the last year of the 4 years' Sejm. It is titled Saira, after the revolutionary French song, which translated into Polish with more syllables as Wszystko pójdzie wyśmienicie. Everything will go splendidly. And so it might have done. But the flip side of the enlightened conviction that anarchy threatened the loss of the country's independence was that good laws and good government would secure the Commonwealth from the appetites of neighbouring powers. In that respect, Saira might have been better translated as Jakoś to będzie, it'll be all right on the night. Russia and Prussia could not tolerate a revitalized Commonwealth, so they put aside their differences, and invasion and retribution followed. After the second partition in 1793, the Commonwealth once more demonstrated its potential during the insurrection led by Tadeusz Kościuszko, and that only accelerated the third and final partition. In Light and Flame, I have highlighted the entanglement of external and internal dynamics in the events that led to the partitions of the Commonwealth. In the process, I've tried to do justice to the sheer vitality of its society, economy, culture, religion, ideas, and last but not least, its politics. Of course, there were far less attractive sides: political myopia, religious bigotry, social oppression, and sexual and economic exploitation, alongside the more positive ones. I haven't glossed over them. Nevertheless, if the Commonwealth could have set its own course for longer, its recovery would have continued. The traitors, and I'm quite happy to explain why I use that word, who led the counter-revolutionary confederacies of Targowice and Wilno or Vilnius in 1792 to 93, could not have established their chaotic and corrupt regimes without the Russian army. In contrast, the Constitution of the 3rd of May fitted the Commonwealth for the challenges of the 19th century, if by some miracle it had survived. The what if underpinning the book is reflected in the structure. It is not an evenly balanced history of the reigns of the Commonwealth's last two monarchs. A halfway point comes as late as 1787, which is previewed in the prologue by the volcanic spectacle of light and flame laid on by King Stanislav August for Catherine II. This was a simulated eruption of Vesuvius. The subsequent events illuminated the Commonwealth for life before its final immolation, and these are covered in greater detail than the decades preceding. But to understand what was achieved in those last few years, we need to start several decades earlier to study the changes in society, ideas, religion, and culture, which were underway before Polish-Lithuanian politics were transformed as well. The well-known end of the story is a tragic one, but there are some surprising, uplifting lessons along the way, and not just for Poles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that terrific introduction, tour d'horizon of the book. I'm sure that there are lots of questions from the audience. Before we open up the discussion, I'd like to just mention that participants of this seminar this evening can purchase the book from Yale University Press at a discounted rate. They can get a 30% discount by going to yalebooks.co.uk and using the promotion code Y2140. And I'll put that into the chat right now. So everyone has it. The way I'd like this discussion to proceed is for people who have questions to either raise their hands using the raise your hand function, and I will call on you, or you can write in the chat, "I have a question," and I will see that and I will call on you from that. The third option is if your internet connection is not that strong for some reason and you don't want to ask the question yourself, you can actually write it in the chat and I will ask it on your behalf. So please, everyone, step up, ask questions. perhaps as the moderator of this session, I could actually ask the first question, and that is about, first of all, sources. Richard, if you found new sources, or if you were synthesizing sources that you'd already found for previous projects, if you could just talk a little bit about sources. And then the other question I'd like to ask is about how this book fits into the most recent historiography on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I mean, you laid out sort of two standard narratives in Poland regarding the Commonwealth, and I wonder about more recent sort of 21st century scholarship and what your contribution is there, and then we'll get to if after that we'll get to Marek and Francois.
Thank you for those kind remarks, Jakub. I know my initial remarks were sort of intentionally kept quite brief about the content rather than the sources and the historiography. I'm very glad you've brought those up. This is a synthesis, and it's primarily a political history, but it's politics in the widest sense, including sort of local participation and the sort of interaction with social, religious, cultural, and even economic factors. So there is social, economic, cultural, plenty of religious history in there, but it is primarily a synthesis of the sort of the political history of the Commonwealth in its last 6 decades, with the emphasis on the last decade or so. So that sort of determines that, above all, it's based on a historiography, which has grown greatly, particularly in the last 30 years or so. But before sort of coming to that, it does draw on sort of archival research and research on sort of old printed books that I've conducted over sort of 3 decades. There are 1 or 2 sort of new archival discoveries. There's a letter from Primate Ponyatovsky where he sort of pretty brutally sums up the state of European politics just before the 4 years same. It's like a bucket of cold water. Nearly all of it came true, but it didn't come true for a great deal longer than he anticipated, and that made a lot of difference. Then I spent a bit of time in the old records of the city of Danzig or Gdańsk. There's a fairly strong sort of Russian, Royal Prussian element to the book. There is also, there are references to the sort of archives in sort of Warsaw, the Vatican, and sort of elsewhere, which are the result of sort of decades of work. Some of these are quite sort of quite old research if it's of my own. And for certain sort of key episodes, such as the meeting of the Ministerial Council in 1792, which decided to end the war against Russia in defense of the Constitution and capitulate on the Empress's terms, then I've sought to look at all the recorded sources relating to that meeting in order to sort of arrive at my own conclusion. I've also been very careful in sort of reconstructing the events and the speeches of the 3rd of May itself, sometimes pointing out discrepancies between what we can find in the archive and what was then sort of published for sort of propaganda effect. But overwhelmingly, this is a work of synthesis that sort of draws on the historiography, as well as printed editions of sources, which have also sort of advanced greatly in the last couple of decades or so, editions of sort of political correspondence, for example. I'd like to sort of highlight 3 major developments in the last 3 decades. In other words, since the sort of the fall of the communist dictatorship in Poland and the fall of the Soviet Union, which transformed the possibilities for researching the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and of the Ukrainian and Volhynian lands, which were also part of the Commonwealth. The first is the Republican turn, which I've sort of already partly alluded to. This goes back to the 1960s in the Anglo-American world, and it sort of provided increasingly an alternative to classical liberalism in political philosophy, which is often denigrated as neoliberalism. It's associated above all with scholars like sort of Quentin Skinner, Philip Petit, and John Pocock. But it's only really been since the turn of the millennium, since about 2000, that scholars in the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth have really seen the potential of this sort of re-evaluation of the early modern European Republican tradition for the understanding the values of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For example, the distinction between non-domination and non-coercion as the distinction between sort of republican understandings of freedom and liberal understandings of freedoms exactly fits the sort of the gut instincts as well as the articulated ideology of the Polish-Lithuanian Szlachta between the 16th and the 18th centuries. So historians, above all, Anna Grzeszkowiak-Krawicz, have sort of transformed our sort of understanding of the sort of ideological and discursive background for the sort of the political arguments and the political decisions that took place in the Commonwealth. But as I've suggested, there has been a bit of a tendency in some quarters, not Anna Grzeszkowiak-Krawicz herself, but in particular some of the more sort of populist interpreters of this development to sort of present the Commonwealth as a kind of forerunner for the European Union, which is sort of pushing it a bit. So that's one thing, the impact of the Republican turn. For my part, I've tried to emphasize that alongside the majority Republican persuasion, there's also a persuasion associated with Stanislav August Ponyatovsky, which I like to describe as limited and parliamentary monarchy, much influenced by Montesquieu and his idea of the separation of powers, albeit in a completely different context, and much influenced by what he saw and admired in Britain in the 1750s as a young man, and which he subsequently kept up. Then there is the second major development, and that is what I would call the new Warsaw School of political and diplomatic history, above all associated with Zofia Zielinska and her pupils. And this group of historians has taken the view that the most important topic to research is the status, the international situation of the state, the degree of autonomy or otherwise it could have, and the explanation of the policies of the surrounding powers, especially the Russian Empire, towards the Commonwealth. And their very impressive research in Russian archives has become much more difficult, incidentally, in the last few years. But from the mid-1990s, for about sort of 15 to 20 years after that, they spent a lot of time in Russian archives, mainly in Moscow, but also in St. Petersburg, which have revealed a pretty consistent picture running right through the 18th century, that at no stage was the Russian Empire inclined to permit the Commonwealth a significant degree of autonomy or strengthening. Policy of the Russian Empire, especially under Catherine the Great, was sort of consistent on that. There was no way in which that would be permitted. It was at least as hostile to that as that of the Kingdom of Prussia, which has borne the brunt of the sort of more traditional historiography of the sort of last decades of the Commonwealth. So that is the sort of the second major historiographical development. And I've tried to convey that because, to be honest, they haven't been very good at communicating these extremely important results of their research in an accessible fashion, especially not to the rest of the world. And then there is the third major development, which has been particularly strong among historians based in independent Lithuania and not so independent Belarus. and that is the exploration of the sort of institutions of the state. I know there's a debate about whether this is a state or a political community. Of course, it was both to some extent. But state-like institutions of central and local government certainly developed quite rapidly in the last third of the 18th century, or rather existing ones were sort of transformed and new ones were added. And partly because of the fact that so much was sort of burnt by the German army in Warsaw at the end of 1944. The records for these institutions are often much better preserved for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania than they are for the Polish crown. And historians like Ramonia Śmigielski-Stukiena, or for example, there is Jerzy Gordiev from Belarus. They have done a great deal to show how the Commonwealth was actually functioning in practice and functioning increasingly professionally in those last few decades and years. So that I think so there is a lot of research produced in Lithuania that has made its way into the sort of further reading and the footnotes, and I've drawn on that in order to try and communicate that achievement better as well. So those are the sort of the three major historiographical developments I'm trying to emphasize.
Great, thank you for that. Let's now turn to the audience. I see two hands so far. First, Marek Słomka. Go ahead and unmute yourself and show yourself if possible.
Right, okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for all of that. Okay, if I can put my question in two parts. I've come across this kind of thesis that governments, regimes can sometimes hasten their own downfall and their ultimate collapse by commencing some kind of reform process. Arguably, I don't know, you can give examples of modern times, like in the 1970s, Iran under the Shah, arguably in Tsarist Russia, the 1905 revolution was arguably more socialist and more authentically leftist than what followed as an opportunistic revolution in 1917. But in 1905, and what immediately followed, was Tsar Nicholas's attempts to reform. But they, but ultimately, it, you know, obviously, the fate of the experiences of Russia in the First World War accelerated that. Could this sort of thesis apply to the fall of the Polish-Lithuanian Republic? And also, if I can just squeeze in a point about the military standing of Poland-Lithuania in the 18th century, I have come across the view that arguably Poland-Lithuania was one of the most militarized societies in Europe in the 18th century. Is that true? But I gather that basically most of the troops, in simple terms, were the private property of the large magnates and the more powerful Szlachta, and that obviously, you know, Kościuszko's uprising notwithstanding, this was, you know, this was the long-term investment in the 18th century, which Poland had lost, certainly compared to the apogee which Sobieski had achieved 100 years earlier. I wonder if you could comment on those points.
Thank you very much for those two very interesting questions. If I can deal with the first one, the second one first. I don't agree that the Commonwealth in the 18th century was a relatively militarized society. Partly this is because for most of the 18th century, it had an extremely small professional army, which most of the time didn't, you know, varied between sort of 12,000 and 18,000. They got it up to 65,000 in 1792, but then you consider that in 1790, the Habsburgs managed to mobilize almost 500,000 men, and the size of the Prussian, Russian, and Austrian armies was regularly somewhere between sort of 200 and sort of 300, even 400,000 towards the end of the 18th century. So it was clearly much smaller. From a population of 10 million They managed to get sort of 65,000 in 1792, whereas the Duchy of Warsaw, with a population of 4 million, managed to sort of raise 100,000 on Napoleon's behalf in 1812. So there's a sort of a clear failure to sort of mobilize a significant proportion of adult males inhabiting the country. What you said may well apply to the sort of the crisis of the mid-17th century, where a large proportion of the Schlachter nobility was involved in military leagues, confederacies, involved in the fight against sort of several invaders at once. But there was a distinct disinclination to do that for the great majority of the 18th century. In fact, there was quite a suspicion of the army as a source of disruption and sort of plunder, and that attitude was only just beginning to change again in the years 1791 to 1792. So the private militias of the magnates have been sort of greatly exaggerated, although someone like Karol Radziwiłł might have been able to put up 5,000 if he really put his mind to it. Most of the time he probably had far less than that available to him. So no, I don't think this was a militarized society. Even the Kościuszko insurrection, which makes a far greater effort to sort of militarize the population, only really sort of exploits a fraction of the sort of the true potential, with the exception perhaps of the people of Warsaw and of Vilna or Vilnius, who really did put up a fight when their cities were besieged in 1794. Now, as to the other thesis of reforms precipitating collapse, and the great example here, I suppose, will be Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. I think that you would have a case here if you could show that there was widespread support among the nobility for the counter-revolutionary confederacies of Targowice and Vilna in 1792. If that were the case, you could then present this as a civil war which had been triggered by political reforms which had gone much too far and sort of provoked a significant part of the nobility to oppose the introduction of a hereditary throne in the constitution of the 3rd of May. Now, the more research that is being done on those counter-revolutionary confederacies, the clearer it becomes that they would have achieved absolutely nothing without the military backing of the imperial Russian army. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where there was an effort apparently to sort of follow the rules better, create local confederacies and then bring them together into a general confederacy, they only managed to confederate something like sort of 3 districts out of about 30-something before they sort of formed the General Confederacy. And most of the confederacies were actually formed after the war had actually ended. They had to rely on corruption, coercion, in order to sort of get anything done at all. So the actual level of support for those confederacies was very limited. After the king had joined, a lot of people reluctantly followed him, but that's not the same thing at all. And if we look at the sejmiks, the local assemblies of the nobility, which were held in February 1792, we see a very decided success for the constitution. There was not a single sejmik that openly criticized it. Perhaps about 10% passed over it in silence, indicating they weren't too happy with it. But at the rest, there were expressions of thanks and support. In almost 3/4, these are very strong expressions of support, including sort of oaths at 27 out of 33 sejmiks in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was, of course, the most exposed to the Russians in 1792. So the argument that reform precipitated collapse only works because reform provoked Russian imperial interests to override what was clearly a going concern, and then tell the world that it had deserved its own end.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Francois Guesnay, I see your hand up.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I very much look forward to read your book. The question I have is, I mean, you know that I'm interested in certain aspects of the late 18th century history of the Rzeczpospolita and how it dealt with its Jewish population. The question I have is, how would you assess the role of the emerging public sphere? I know from the perspective of the representatives of the Jewish population, the various councils, there were more and more attempts from the 1750s onwards to engage with what we could call a public sphere. So publications addressed not to specific individuals, but to the public. If you think about what you describe as which is a positive narrative about the late Rzeczpospolita, how would you describe the transformation of the public sphere? And obviously, I'm working here on the basic of a premise based on Habermas and empathetic understanding of the public sphere as a democratically active factor here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. It's great to have you with us this afternoon. It's good to see you for the second time this afternoon. Some of the things regarding the politics of history and memory are also bearing in mind some of the things we were talking about earlier. Now, with regard to the impact of the idea of the public and the public sphere, I think it's fair to say that sort of that hasn't made a huge impact on sort of our understanding of the Commonwealth in its sort of last few decades, although there have been a few of us that have tried to do something with this. It's clear from the sources that in the last few decades, and particularly the last few years of the Commonwealth, there is a public sphere which is called the publiczność, more rarely the older Latin version, the publicum, which is addressed by people involved in politics. It's addressed by people who are writing pamphlets. It's addressed in terms of theatre audiences. It's addressed sometimes during debates in Parliament by people who say, you know, listen to me, O most serene estates, listen to me, O virtuous public. We get expressions like that, and it's not just the public sitting in the gallery, but it's also those that are going to read the reports in the sort of newspapers as well. So the public is clearly there in the sources, and it does mean people who are sort of outside the immediate decision-making process. Some of whom could be women, some of whom could be burghers, some of whom might be in sort of country manor houses or country towns or country parishes, you know, and maybe even it also includes the Jewish communities of the Commonwealth, who, as you say, are engaged in trying to put their case in the Polish language to others as well, not just in the forms of sort of unpublished petitions, but in terms of public addresses as well. So this is something that's clearly developing quite dynamically, particularly after the 4 years same begins in 1788, but it's there before that as well. Now, in the sense of whether this can be related to sort of Habermas or not, we have a fairly extreme a fairly extreme problem of the type that's already been pointed out elsewhere, namely Habermas's assumption that discussions about culture precede discussions on politics, because that was clearly not the case in the Commonwealth. We also have the circumstance that this is a sort of republican form of government with a republican set of civic values, where everything that is public is supposed to be political. And so that the very name of the public is written into the name of the community, in other words, the res publica or Rzeczpospolita. So in that sense, the concept of the public can and should be applied. It's very fruitful, but certainly it needs a lot of modification from the sort of Habermasian model, even more so than in most other parts of Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Please step forward or raise your hand in the chat. We still have about up to 40 minutes. We sometimes finish around 6:15, but we can, if the discussion is flowing, we can go all the way to 6:30.
Perhaps at this point, I should say that I very much benefited from Francois's research on the sort of international discussions that preceded the abolition of judicial torture and trials for witchcraft in the Commonwealth in 1776. I was present at an excellent lecture he gave at UCL on the international organization of Jews and sympathizers who pointed out the so-called blood libel, this idea that Jews use the blood of Christian children for sort of religious ritual, was complete rubbish. And the influence this had in the sort of wider decision to abolish torture in judicial cases, as well as trials for witchcraft at the same of 1776.
Well, if no one is going to step forward right now, maybe I could just ask another question. You mentioned during your talk that you deliberately retain the term traitors for the conspiracy of Targovica. I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit more. You sort of imply that that's a somewhat controversial position. Maybe you could elucidate that further.
Certainly, I'm happy to do that. By the way, there's a question in the chat from sort of Andrew Thorpe, which we can take afterwards. The reason the idea of treason is extraordinarily emotive. It's one of those words that gets flung around in political arguments, and that's certainly the case in Poland today. That the word Targowica itself also gets flung around as an insult in political arguments, as a way of sort of disqualifying sort of opponents. You have to be sort of aware that this is a very sort of emotive term. It was, of course, a word that was used very often at the time as well. But if you look at the legal position in 1792, you find that treason is defined relatively precisely by early modern standards in a series of laws, above all in 1588, including the Third Lithuanian Statute. Also in revisions in 1609, following the end of a sort of a revolt against King Sigismund III. There are also some sort of updates which rather sort of make it easier to apply in 1776 and 1789. Well, if you go back to those laws, and I sort of detail them sort of in the book, some of the things, such as sort of surrendering fortresses in cahoots with the enemy, sort of planning and executing an armed revolt against the king and the same, are exactly what the leading confederates of Targowica and Vilna were doing in 1792. Scarcely more than a dozen of them sort of took themselves off to St. Petersburg to supplicate the help of the great Empress Catherine in order to overthrow a constitution which had been approved not only unanimously by the same, not on the 3rd of May, but on the 5th of May. But also then sort of confirmed with a great show of enthusiasm at Sejmiks right across the Commonwealth. It soon became blatantly clear to them they had almost no level of sort of authentic support for their position whatsoever. And so they brought in the sort of imperial Russian army, which then sort of overthrew the constitution. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them may have been naive enough to believe that they did so to sort of restore the sort of ancient republican liberty of the nobility. and were genuinely taken by surprise when the Russians promptly did a deal with the Prussians in order to carve up the Commonwealth for the second time. So I think we can quite reasonably call them traitors to their country. In the specific case of Józef and Szymon Kosakowski, who headed up de facto the Confederacy and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, these were the people who then imposed a regime on the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was even more oppressive than the regime in the Crown. They exploited, extorted, and oppressed their sort of fellow noblemen of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, all the while sort of shouting about how they were sort of restoring the dual structure of the Commonwealth, which had in fact been solemnly reassured in October 1791 anyway. So there is a kind of tendency at the moment to kind of sort of rehabilitate Targowice as a sort of a flawed but understandable Republican reaction to this sort of unwarranted, sort of enlightened, cosmopolitan, monarchical modernization of the Commonwealth.
Okay,
So
well,
if there are any sort of sympathizers of those Confederates here, then please come forward and we can have an argument.
well, I'm convinced. Now let's go to a question from Andrew Thorpe, who says, I'm asking a question to help my sixth formers and me who have joined the meeting. Welcome, sixth formers. You have used the word Schlachta, which I probably spelled wrongly. Can you explain what this was and why this body was so influential, please?
Right. The Schlachta, which it's interesting you spelt it like that, because the etymology of the word comes from the German word Schlacht, which means a fight, a battle. And the Schlachta, S-Z-L-A-C-H-T-A, was the sort of is the Polish word for nobility. It shouldn't be translated as gentry, because it wasn't the same sort of thing as the sort of English country gentleman at all, because the English country gentleman had very little legally to sort of define his status. This is a hereditary privileged legal status, which is enjoyed by a very large number of people. By the 18th century, we're talking about sort of maybe 750,000 people, which means that a few 100,000 adult males are actively involved in politics. They have the right to attend the Sejmiks. They have the right, if they wish to, sort of go to a field outside Warsaw and elect the king. These are the people who have the privilege of no imprisonment without trial. These are people who can elect their delegates or envoys, sometimes called deputies, to the parliament or Sejm. These are people who claim the right to resist the king should the king break the contract with which he has agreed to swear to at his election and then reinforced at the coronation. So we have a very large privileged nobility, which calls itself the Schlachta and increasingly sees itself as the nation. The nation then begins to expand again beyond the Schlachta in the last few years of the Commonwealth. And the Schlachta has on the whole had a very bad reputation for being ignorant, anarchic, and oppressive. Although perhaps this is beginning to sort of change a bit in sort of more recent historiography. About 40% of these people were probably landless and illiterate, and real wealth and influence and power was concentrated in a few dozen families at the very top. But there was a significant number, sort of the top decile or the top two deciles of sort of middling to sort of wealthy noblemen who might have had a few villages, a few hundred, would have been the lords of a few hundred peasants, and who could cut a figure in sort of local and occasionally even national politics. And this group becomes a great deal more active and engaged on a civic basis towards the end of the 18th century, just as it had been in the second half of the 16th century. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question, Mr. Thorpe.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. That was very clear. Thank you.
Right. In terms of its size, I mean, the Schlachta is really only comparable to the Hungarian nobility at this time, isn't it? And I mean, of course, England has an extremely puny nobility by comparison, right? Under 1% or something like that at this time.
Yeah, in technical terms, the English nobility is the peerage, which in the 18th century is about 100 people, rising to about 200 by the very end of the 18th century. The Hungarian nobility is the next largest in Europe, and then I think after that it will be the Spanish. They're the only ones that are sort of reasonably comparable, where you have very large numbers of sort of poor but entitled and privileged people.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Marek has asked another quick question here about the Polish royal elections, which are often seen as a weakness of the Commonwealth and a symptom of its frailty. And he's asking if the results of these royal elections are available anywhere, at the same time realizing that such results may not be comparable to kind of modern elections.
Right. Well, there are two things there. One's the question of whether this is a strength or a weakness, and the other is the question of the results. I'm not aware of a website or a publication that sort of gives you all in one place how many thousand votes for one candidate and how many thousand for another. But I can give you sort of three statistics off the top of my head. The greatest number of people that ever turned up for an election was in 1669, when about 80,000 people turned up outside Warsaw in very disorderly conditions. They even started shooting at the senators at one point in order to choose a non-entity called Michał Wiśniowiecki as a sort of a native-born king following a succession of Swedes of the so-called Vasa dynasty. Then in 1733, we get about 13,000 turning up outside Warsaw to elect Stanislav Leszczyński, who was the the father-in-law of the King of France, Louis XV. And of course, France supported his election, but he was a genuinely sort of popular choice. And he was opposed by the 3,000 to 4,000 or so who wanted to elect the Elector or Duke of Saxony, who eventually did succeed, thanks to the intervention of the Russian army, because the French didn't really take the campaign seriously, as King Augustus III. So he was both Elector of Saxony and King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania at the same time. Then in 1764, I can tell you this exactly, 5,584 nobles signed the election of Stanislav August Ponyatovsky, which was a low turnout. It was witnessed by a much larger number of spectators of both sexes, but of course this was the outcome of a military campaign in which the Russian army and the supporters of Poniatowski's own family had eliminated and forced into exile those who preferred yet another Saxon candidate or a replacement to be elected instead. Now, as to whether this is a strength or a weakness, well, everyone by the time of the Constitution of the 3rd of May recognized that the elections had become an occasion for civil war. They'd become an occasion for sort of foreign intervention. But the question was whether you sort of sorted out a better form of election, preferably sort of doing it while the previous king was still alive. This is known as the vivente rege option. Jean-Jacques Rousseau even comes up with an idea of sort of doing it by lot from among the senators. Or alternatively, whether you sort of go down the normal road for the 18th century, which is sort of hereditary succession in a family. And by far the most popular option is the Saxon royal family, which is chosen, but the details of how that is sorted out actually proved to be rather complex and difficult, and it's difficult to say that they sort of made a good job of arranging the succession in 1791. But there was a good deal of consensus that elections in the way they'd happened until then simply sort of could not go on. Whether they were right to try and go all the way straight away for a hereditary monarchy is very much more controversial.
Okay, now we have a question in the chat from Georgia Bauer, who's asking why the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth seems to be so overlooked in Western European history writing. Can you comment on that, Richard?
Well, thank you for the comment. I think it's a great deal less overlooked now than it was 30 years ago or so. If you go back to the 1980s, you had Norman Davis, Adam Zamoyski was just beginning. And as for the sort of the other specialists, well, there were few of them and they were hardly well known at all. There are more of us now, and we're making more of an impact on both sides of the Atlantic and on both sides of the Channel. So I think the situation is a great deal better. Now, partly the reason, but undoubtedly it sort of can't be compared, for example, with the sort of the attention given to the Habsburg monarchy, let alone to the attention given to, say, Spain. It is still regarded as rather marginal. Partly because it lost, although that doesn't explain why there's so little attention given to the Commonwealth in the 16th and early 17th centuries, when it was very much winning. Partly this is down to that narrative created by the sort of partitioning powers and a lot of Poles themselves, that this was a failed state dominated by its sort of ignorant and anarchic and oppressive nobility or Schlachter. Partly because it's actually rather difficult to sort of do research on Poland-Lithuania without knowledge of the Polish language and several others. Increasingly, Lithuanians become important, especially for the historiography, not for the sources. Belarusian or Ukrainian too, not to mention for the diplomatic sources. Then Russian and German can be important. And for the 18th century, there is still a role for sort of Latin, Italian in Vatican diplomacy. And above all, the 18th century, you simply have to have French. Now, that's true of a lot of other European countries as well, but it's certainly true of the Commonwealth. And French is becoming an increasingly rare skill for sort of historians at British universities today. So the linguistics of it, as well as actually not many people wanted to go to sort of communist Poland to do the research. It wasn't a very sort of glamorous place to go. And as for research on the eastern half of the Commonwealth, in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in the Ukrainian and Volhynian lands, well, that was even more sort of exotic. And so what perceptions there were of the Commonwealth tended to be very much filtered through the sort of Poland rather than the sort of other successor states of the Commonwealth. But I think this is sort of changing fast. And I hope that this book will be, one more contribution to that worthy cause.
Yes, once again, the link to Yale books to this book is in the chat, along with a promo code for 30% off. Now let's go to a question from, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Cheaton Gruel, who asks, could you talk a bit about the importance of Sarmatism in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Was it a purely cultural construct, or did it have political implications? For example, did it serve to create a national myth to distinguish the Poles from their other Slavic and non-Slavic Germanic neighbors?
Thank you. It's great you're here on the northern side of the Carpathians, Chetan, because we've been sort of studying the Habsburg monarchy together. Sarmatism, it's a fascinating subject. And now the sort of original Sarmatians were the sort of warriors on the north side of the Black Sea that sort of gave the Roman Empire quite a hard time for several centuries. And then they were then sort of transformed into sort of cavalrymen of the sort of the Roman Empire itself in its sort of declining phase. And they make a bit of an appearance in the film King Arthur from about sort of 15 years ago. Now, that is known through sort of surviving histories from the classical age. And the idea of Sarmatia as a place somewhere sort of east of Europe and sort of partly overlapping with Asia and somewhere north of the Black Sea, that continues through the geography of the medieval and Renaissance worlds. And in the 16th century, there are some sort of mentions a little earlier. It's increasingly fashionable among the sort of Polish and then later on the Ruthenian, Prussian and Lithuanian nobilities to claim that they are the descendants of the Sarmatians. In other words, it's a sort of a Renaissance era sort of collective pedigree. In the same way that the English used to claim that they were descended from the Trojans. And the same way that the French nobility claimed they were descended from the Franks who had invaded Gaul, and that the Gauls were the ancestors of the peasants. Now, this collective genealogy is in one way quite typical, but it becomes a kind of synonym for the people, the nobles, whether they're of sort of Lithuanian origin or Ruthenian origin or Prussian origin, in some cases Prussian burghers as well. It's true that the richest and most powerful Lithuanian families like to claim they're descended from Roman patricians. That's getting a sense of one-upmanship on the Poles from the crown. They descend from sort of Palemon in their sort of mythology, but the Sarmatian identity is also very popular as well. So it becomes a kind of lifestyle and a shorthand for the sort of the values, as well as the sort of appearance, the characteristic dress of the nobility with their long robes, the contushes, the characteristic moustaches. And of course, you will have noticed, what Hungarian nobles looked like in the 16th and 17th centuries. Well, the nobles of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth really look quite similar. And even if the Hungarians are probably a little bit more attached to their moustaches than the Poles. However, from the 1760s onwards, Sarmatism, and I think on the whole, when you start talking about isms, they're generally pejorative. Sarmatism becomes a label with which to sort of satirize and criticize the faults of the nobility, that they are sort of ignorant and superstitious and sort of, complete stuck in the muds, unable to sort of deal with the modern world. And so that sort of ism becomes a label, and sort of fashionable, sort of progressive people start talking about Sarmatians as a kind of shorthand for sort of unwashed, mustachioed nobles with very unenlightened views. And that in turn sparked a revival from the 1770s, 1780s onwards, where Sarmatian and Sarmatism became badges of pride. And ever since then, in sort of Polish culture, the Sarmatians and the anti-Sarmatians have been at it sort of hammer and tongs, and it's still going.
Great. Now we move to a very interesting question from Martinas Tsekovicius. What lessons can we learn from the Commonwealth's collapse? And do you see any parallels between the last decades of the Commonwealth and any modern states?
Oh, precisely the sort of question most historians spend a lot of time trying to avoid answering. I think there are, well, let's start with the idea of the lessons. It was shocking at the time, and I still think it's a bit shocking, that a large and well-established state or political community in Europe was cynically taken apart by its neighbours at the end of the 18th century. Now, it wasn't the first project for a partition. It nearly happened to Prussia in the 1750s. It nearly happened to Austria in the 1740s. But it very rare, such schemes on this scale, and plenty of smaller states were sort of gobbled up by their neighbours or taken apart. But it rarely happened on this scale. And it was accompanied by a particularly mendacious narrative of a failure that needed to be put out of its anarchic misery. So in that sense, if you are part of a state or a political community that sort of ends up on the losing side of history against a sort of stronger neighbours with a sort of a well-organized sort of propaganda machine, you're going to find it very hard to convince the rest of the world that you shouldn't be forgotten, that you have something to contribute to the general cause of humanity. In particular, as in the case of this particular political community, it shows tremendous sort of vitality, resourcefulness. It reaches back into its sort of own values, its own heritage of sort of republican liberty, and manages to update that. It manages to sort of open itself up to influences from abroad in order to sort of mix those things together in a way that sort of suits itself. And above all, the political community itself is capable of it opening the doors, first of all to the burghers, and then much more tentatively, but with certain perspectives, to all the inhabitants of the Commonwealth. That at least was the sort of the direction of travel. So I think those are the kind of sort of lessons that that can be learnt. This is a political community whose value is liberty. Liberty can be understood in all sorts of different ways, but you can't enjoy either individual or collective liberty if you are being ruled by an absolute monarchy of a foreign power. As for any modern day states, well, I think that there are certain parallels between the geopolitical expansion as well as some of the narratives put out by the Russian Empire in the 18th century, for example, regarding the annexation of the Crimea, and the activities of the neo-Russian Empire with regard to some of its neighbours, not least in the way it deals with them in a propaganda basis at the moment.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Don't be shy.
We also don't have to. We don't have to go right to 6:30. Richard, you've illuminated vast territories of this relatively unknown state for us already. But I see a hand here from David Dalborn. David, please unmute yourself and ask your question. David?
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for a splendid presentation. And I'd like to say hello as well, because about 7 years ago, you were my seminar tutor at UCL.
Wonderful.
I'm really excited to listen in tonight. I wanted to ask a question that I'll confess I'm fairly ignorant about, but I've always wanted to ask, even though I know nothing. I don't know if there's anything to it, but I was wondering, I'm asking only because they used the word Commonwealth in their official title, and that is was there any, while they were contemporaries, were there any connections between the Polish Commonwealth and the English Commonwealth? Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to see you again, actually for the second time this afternoon, David, and I greatly appreciate your work for the Institute of Polish Jewish Studies. The term Commonwealth is an early translation from the Latin res publica. One of the, this was done in, for example, in 16th, 17th century England. The standard translation of res publica was Commonwealth rather than Republic. In the 18th century, the English language starts to use, Republic, usually spelt with a K on the end after the C more often. And in Polish, the term Rzeczpospolita was another early translation from the Latin res publica. Nowadays, the standard Polish word is Republika, but for the sake of tradition, they still call the state the Rzeczpospolita. So literally, it means thing common or shared or general. So the public good, the public weal, and so on. It's a way of the common weal, the commonwealth. That's what the term means. The name of the Commonwealth actually is quite imprecise. In the 17th century, it still signed international treaties as the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Well, sometimes we get the impression, and in the past I've contributed to this impression, that the official name of the state was the Commonwealth of the two nations, Polish and Lithuanian. Well, you won't find that in any official document, not even in the Union of Lublin of 1569, which sort of consolidated the Lithuanian-Polish union. In the 18th century, the general term sort of Poland, or the Republic of Poland, or the King and the Republic of Poland, which was the usual form in international treaties, became much more common. But on the other hand, the term Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth expresses a sort of a more general truth about the way in which the community was constructed. I don't think we need to send Polish and Lithuanian in opposition to each other. If you look at the records produced by the nobility in the 18th century, they're constantly talking either about the Lithuanian nation or the Polish nation, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania or the Lithuanian province or the Kingdom of Poland. And it's quite clear that they belong to all of these things.
Okay, we have a question from Stefan Lachny. Go ahead.
Hi. So I'm a passive observer of Polish politics, and I noticed that there are certain words from the Commonwealth that are still used in Polish politics today, such as Sejm, Sejmik, and of course Rzeczpospolita. But I was wondering, what heritage in political terms is there from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that have survived over the centuries into modern Polish politics?
That's a really big question. Thank you very much, Stefan, for that question. Well, there is part of the terminology, although we note that it's at the margins, such as the Confederacja, that we sort of get some of the most obvious sort of borrowings. This idea of a sort of a patriotic insurrection is sort of there at the margins. There was also the Konfederacja Polski Niepodległej under Leszek Moczulski, which proposed to bring back sort of wojewodowia and castellani into the Senate, the Palatine being the older sort of Latin-derived version of vojevoda. So, yeah, but I don't think that sort of the technology is that important. You can sort of find sort of archaisms in a lot of other countries, not least in the UK. It's entirely understandable that certain traditional words are sort of retained in the Second Republic, and then again even by the Polish People's Republic, in order to sort of reassure people about a degree of continuity, which was not exactly broken, but certainly strained to a very thin thread during the sort of long 19th century. I'm much more skeptical about the idea that a certain political culture has survived. I mean, you can talk about stereotypes of anarchy, and back in the 1980s, people used to compare solidarity meetings to Sejmiks. But I think that if you go to the sort of, what I regard as probably the most valuable thing in sort of old Polish-Lithuanian political culture, which is sort of debating and discussing something in order to thrash out a compromise and a consensus, which can then be sort of accepted by everyone in the name of the general good, then I think we're very far away from that indeed in contemporary Polish politics, and indeed in contemporary politics more generally across the world. I think it's hard to find countries where you have that sort of as a principal virtue. There is the tendency in Poland, as in most other places, is for sort of treat parliamentary votes as sort of mechanical things. We've got the majority, we can do what we like, we can do it at the last minute. We don't have to listen to anyone else's argument, we don't have to weigh it up. No, I think that side of it has gone. I also think that when Kosciuszko was proclaimed the Naczelnik, and when in the insurrections, which were looking back to the Commonwealth of 1830 and 1863, you get the shocking word to modern ears of dictator. This was looking back to the old ancient Roman institute of the dictatorship, with a degree of caution, of course, because we know what happened to Julius Caesar. And of course, their classical education would have made this a very close example. But by the 1920s, we have a disdain for the sort of for parliamentary ways of doing things. And I think that sort of Pilsudski and his contemporary Antanas Smetana in Lithuania in 1926, they both sort of put through coups against parliamentary democracy. And there is a considerable degree of social acceptance of these norms in both countries. So I still think actually sort of that respect for sort of democratic parliamentary politics is rather sort of fragile in Poland at the moment. And a considerable part, no, probably not a majority, but a considerable part of society would accept an authoritarian form of government. So in that sense, it's a very pessimistic answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think the question that's posed by Chris Carling will have to be the last question of the evening, and that is, can you say anything more briefly about the links between the Commonwealth and the modern-day EU?
Thank you. This is something which is very much in the sort of interests of both modern Poland and modern Lithuania. To sort of promote that the idea you can have a sort of voluntary union between communities that makes them sort of stronger together. I do think that it's perhaps a little sort of overblown. A fair amount of time has now elapsed. What I think is important is that sort of forums such as the European Parliament should be used to convince those Westerners who believe otherwise that in East Central Europe there are constitutional, republican, libertarian, civic traditions, which are part of a common European heritage, including the Constitution of the 3rd of May, but not only the Constitution of the 3rd of May. There's the Confederacy of Warsaw of 1573, which was about a mutual agreement between equal citizens not to persecute each other on religious grounds. There was the law of nihil novi, that nothing new concerning us without our consent. This is the expression of the sort of the lower house of parliament. And in the Hungarian context, for example, you have the Golden Bull. Then you have the sort of the old constitutional tradition of the Kingdom of Bohemia. And if you want to go even further back and even further east, then you've got the sort of the city republic of Novgorod the Great. So it's not necessarily the case that sort of democracy, human rights, rule of law, respect for the individual are sort of inventions of the French Revolution and the American Revolution and then exported to primitive backward Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think on that spirited and topical note, we should probably adjourn for the evening. I mean, we do have a couple more very interesting questions, but we are running out of time. I'm going to have to say goodnight to everybody shortly. Unless you can answer these questions in a minute or two.
I'll start with Tomasz Kazimierski because he hasn't had the opportunity to answer a question before. And the Liberal Veto the Liberal Veto sort of got completely sort of out of hand, taken into absurd lengths. It became the right of a single member of parliament, not just to object to a particular piece of legislation or taxation, but to bring all the proceedings to a halt, ensuring that everything which had been agreed up to that point was annulled. Now, foreign powers soon got wind of the opportunity to sort of to paralyze the legislature of the Commonwealth and prevent significant reforms, so that by the end of the 17th century, more Seims were being broken up than were successfully concluding. And by the middle of the 18th century, there was only one Seim in the reign of Augustus III, which did any business at all. So in that sense, it is this legislative paralysis was probably the most important institutional reason why the Commonwealth became so vulnerable to its neighbours. And it was one of the things that was finally put right in the Constitution of the 3rd of May. As for Rétan, well, this just goes to show that if the Liberal Veto had been able to prevent the destruction of the Commonwealth and its liberty by a corrupt majority, then it didn't work. You have the corrupt majority overriding the virtuous minority in the form of Rétan and his colleagues. So that, I hope, answers your question. And regarding Georgia Bowers, there were a lot of, thank you, I recognize this question. There were a lot of sort of intermarriages between the Commonwealth monarchs and the Habsburgs in the sort of the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. But every time the Habsburgs tried to get one of their own elected to the Polish-Lithuanian throne, they failed, sometimes at the receiving end of a war, which shows that the majority of the nobility simply believed that the Habsburgs would assault their liberty and they didn't want to have one of them on the throne.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. I'm sure all of us will also join me in thanking you for this incredibly stimulating seminar this evening. The book sounds wonderful. I can't wait to read it myself. And thank you all again for coming. I don't think we will have an event in this seminar series next month. I had something in mind which didn't exactly pan out, but the next scheduled event is on the 23rd of March by a lecturer at the University of Leiden, Sarah Cramsey, and her talk is tentatively called Uprooting the Diaspora, Jewish Belonging and the Ethnic Revolution in Poland and Czechoslovakia, 1936 to 1946. That sounds very interesting, and hopefully many of you can join us for that. But once again, thank you, Richard, and thank you all for coming. And I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you, Jakob, and thank you, everyone.